The Galactic Council had seen many things across the millennia. Planets reduced to ash, fleets swallowed by black holes, civilizations rising and falling like waves on a cosmic shore. But never, in all their recorded history, had they witnessed something so utterly absurd, so impossibly reckless, that even the cold, calculating minds of the Zalari warlords paused in disbelief. The humans had built a warship out of that? Admiral Vorkath of the Zalari Dominion narrowed his many eyes, his mandibles clicking in irritation as he studied the holographic projection before him. The humans should have been easy to crush, their primitive technology barely a speck against the might of the Dominion. Their planets were scattered, their fleets laughably outdated, and yet, here they were, standing defiantly on the battlefield with something that shouldn't exist. Something that couldn't exist. It drifted in space, an abomination of engineering, patched together from salvaged cargo freighters, mining rigs, and, if his sensors weren't malfunctioning, a derelict space station. A civilian space station, not even built for combat. And yet, it moved with purpose. Its makeshift armor bristling with scavenged weapons, its crude engines flaring with an energy that shouldn't be possible. "Run another scan," Vorkath growled, his voice a deep, guttural hiss. A smaller Zalari officer, hunched and jittery, tapped at the console. "Admiral, the energy signatures are erratic, but the weapon output is substantial. Their shields are irregular, but adaptive, and their propulsion—" The officer hesitated. "Their propulsion shouldn't work, but it does." Vorkath's clawed fingers dug into the metal of his command chair. He didn't need to be told what was happening. The humans had done what they always did. They had refused to die quietly. They had refused to surrender. And somehow, through sheer insanity or desperation, they had turned a pile of junk into a war machine that defied every law of military strategy. On the human side of the battlefield, Captain Elias Rourke sat in the dimly lit command deck of the Ironclad. The ship creaked and groaned around him, its hull a patchwork of old-world steel and scavenged alloys. It was ugly, it was barely holding together, and yet it was theirs. "Status?" Rourke called, his voice steady despite the odds stacked against them. Lieutenant Harris, a wiry woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, smirked as she read the reports. "Shields are fluctuating but holding. The primary railguns are charging, mostly. And engineering says if we push the thrusters any harder, we might become the first warship in history to spontaneously fall apart before getting shot." "Good to know," Rourke muttered. He turned to the viewport, staring at the massive Zalari dreadnought in the distance. It was sleek, powerful, and built for one purpose: domination. His ship, by contrast, looked like something a scrapyard would have rejected. But it wasn't just metal and circuitry that made a warship, it was the people inside it. "All stations, prepare for combat," Rourke ordered. "Let's show these bastards what human ingenuity looks like." On the Zalari flagship, Vorkath's mandibles twitched in irritation as he watched the human vessel shift into attack formation. "They're actually going to fight?" he murmured, half in disbelief. He could almost admire the insanity. Almost. A warship built from scrap, piloted by a species that refused to die. This should have been a simple battle, another easy victory for the Dominion. But something in Vorkath's gut told him otherwise. For the first time in centuries, the Zalari Dominion was about to learn what happened when you underestimated humanity. The silence in the void stretched thin, a tense, suffocating moment where the universe seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a flicker of raw energy, the first shot was fired. A bright, searing bolt lanced through the blackness, streaking toward the Ironclad. The Zalari dreadnought's weapons had spoken. The battle had begun. Rourke braced himself as the ship trembled under the force of its own desperate maneuvering. The Ironclad wasn't fast, not in any traditional sense, but its mix-and-match thrusters gave it an unpredictable, almost chaotic movement pattern. To the Zalari, it must have looked like a dying beast, flailing in its final moments. But Rourke knew better. This ship had heart. "Damage report," he barked. Minimal, Harris replied, fingers flying over the console. Armor's holding. Looks like they're testing us, seeing how much punishment we can take before we break. Rourke's jaw tightened. He knew the Zilari's tactics. Overwhelm the enemy, crush their morale before the real fight even started. But humans weren't built that way. They didn't break when pushed. They fought harder. "Comms, open a channel to the fleet," he ordered. A second later, a burst of static filled the bridge before clearing. "This is Captain Rourke of the Ironclad," he said, voice steady despite the odds stacked against them. "We hold the line here. No one backs down. We show them exactly why humanity isn't so easily erased." A chorus of acknowledgements crackled over the comms. Other captains, other ships, all battered and bruised, but still standing. It wasn't just his crew that had refused to run. It was every last human willing to fight for their survival. On the Jalari command deck, Vorkath watched with narrowed eyes as the human ships adjusted their formation. It was messy, erratic, nothing like the precise movements of a trained warfleet. And yet, something about it made his exoskeleton itch with unease. "Why haven't they retreated?" he murmured. The officer beside him hesitated. "Perhaps they believe they have a chance?" Vorkath let out a dry, humorless hiss. "A chance? With that wreck of a warship?" His gaze flicked back to the Ironclad. The sensors continued to insist that the ship should be falling apart, that its power output was a disaster waiting to happen, that its weapons were a crude joke compared to Zilari precision firepower. And yet, it had survived the first volley. That was more than most. "Increase firepower," Vorkath ordered. "Let's end this before their madness infects our own soldiers." The dreadnought's cannons charged again, energy thrumming through its hull. This time, there would be no warning shots. Back on the Ironclad, the tension thickened as the ship's sensors picked up the charging weapons. "They're going for a full strike," Harris warned. "But the shields won't hold against a direct hit from that kind of firepower." Rourke nodded. He had expected this. The Zilari didn't play games when they felt threatened. That meant only one thing. They were starting to take the humans seriously. "Engineering!" he called over the comms. "How's our surprise package looking?" A gruff voice responded, laced with exhaustion. "If you're asking whether it'll work, I'd say 50-50. If you're asking whether it'll kill us first, I'd say probably." Rourke exhaled sharply. "I'll take those odds. Get it ready." Harris gave him a wary glance. "Sir, are we really about to pull this off?" He smirked, though there was no humor in it. "If we don't, we're dead anyway." The ship shook as the Zilari's next attack streaked toward them. In that moment, surrounded by fire and uncertainty, Rourke knew one thing for sure. Humanity had never won wars through superior firepower. They had won through ingenuity, through sheer, stubborn refusal to lose. And if the Zilari thought they had seen everything humans were capable of, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The Ironclad lurched violently as the Zilari dreadnought's barrage slammed into its hull. Metal groaned, warning lights flickered, and a few loose panels rattled from the sheer force of the impact. The bridge filled with the sharp scent of burning circuits, but the ship held together. Barely. "Field down to 20%, Harris shouted over the alarms. "We can't take another hit like that." Rourke gritted his teeth. He could hear the desperation in her voice, but they had no choice. They couldn't run, not now. The moment they turned their backs, the Zilari would pick them off like helpless prey. No! The only way forward was through. "Engineering, status on the package." He barked into the comms. A deep, ragged breath crackled over the line before the chief engineer responded. "It's primed, but if we detonate at the wrong angle, we might as well be signing our own death certificate." Rourke glanced at the main display, watching as the Zilari fleet tightened its formation, slowly encircling them like a noose. Time was running out. On the Zilari command deck, Admiral Vorkath's eyes remained locked on the battle, studying the Ironclad with something bordering on fascination. The humans should have been crippled by now. Their shields were failing, their weapons outdated, their defenses barely holding. and yet they refused to break. "This is beyond foolish," his second-in-command muttered. "They are delaying the inevitable." Vorkoth didn't respond immediately. He had been in enough battles to recognize the scent of desperation, but this felt different. There was something about the humans, something unpredictable. They weren't just fighting to survive. They were playing a game no one else could see. His gaze narrowed. "They're stalling." The realization struck like a lightning bolt. The humans weren't just prolonging the fight out of stubbornness. They were waiting for something. He turned sharply toward his officers. "Scan their ship, again." The officer hesitated. "Admiral, we've already—" "Do it!" The bridge fell silent as the new scan ran. Data streamed across the displays, numbers shifting and recalculating. Then the results came in. Vorkath's mandibles twitched. "That's not possible." The humans had a weapon, a device buried deep in their ship's chaotic infrastructure, its energy readings flickering between nonsense and catastrophe. The readings were unstable, unreadable even, but one thing was clear. Whatever it wasn't standard human technology. "Target that ship with everything we have," Vorkoth ordered, his voice low and firm. "Now." Back on the ironclad, Rourke clenched his fists as the Zelari ships adjusted their course. They knew. "They're on to us," Harris muttered. "We expected this," Rourke said, forcing himself to stay calm. "We stick to the plan." The problem was, the plan was insane. Their so-called weapon wasn't a traditional warhead, nor was it any kind of advanced technology. It was, at its core, a desperate gamble. An experimental gravitational bomb built from scavenged parts and barely tested theories. If it worked, it could warp space just long enough to destabilize the Zelari formation, creating an opening for a counterattack. If it failed, well, they wouldn't be around to care. "Captain," the engineer's voice came through again, lower this time. "It's ready." Rourke inhaled slowly. "All right then, let's give our friends out there a surprise." The Zelari dreadnought's weapons flared, ready to unleash a killing blow. Harris hesitated. "Sir, if this thing doesn't go off the way we want it to—" Rourke didn't let her finish. "We don't have time to second guess. Do it." The engineer hit the trigger. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, space itself seemed to twist. The stars warped, the Zelari ships wavered like reflections in disturbed water, and a deep, resonant hum filled the void. Admiral Vorkath jolted upright as alarms blared across his bridge. His officers scrambled, shouting calculations that made no sense. "What have they done?" he whispered. The battlefield was no longer stable. Gravity shifted unpredictably, pulling ships at odd angles, disrupting their precise formations. The Zelari fleet, so perfectly coordinated moments ago, was now scattered, struggling against an invisible force that refused to obey the laws of physics. And at the center of the chaos, the ironclad remained eerily still. Rourke watched the unfolding disaster, heart pounding. He had expected a disturbance, but this was something else. Then, something even more unexpected happened. The ironclad sensors detected a new signal, something massive, something not Zelari. Harris stiffened. "Sir, we have incoming." The screen flickered, and for the first time since the battle began, Rourke felt a true chill run down his spine. Because whatever was coming, it wasn't human. And it wasn't friendly. The hum in space deepened, vibrating through the ironclad's hull like a pulse from something ancient and immense. The distortion they had created wasn't settling, it was growing, stretching like a wound in the fabric of reality itself. The Zelari fleet was still reeling, their once impenetrable formation shattered, their ships scrambling to adjust to the unpredictable gravitational shifts. But now, something else had entered the battlefield, something that had been waiting. Rourke's fingers tightened around the armrests of his chair as the sensors continued to struggle with the readings. The signal was unlike anything he had ever seen before, Strong, layered, fluctuating between energy spectrums that shouldn't exist in the same space. It was neither human nor Zelari, and that made it infinitely worse. "Where the hell did that come from?" Harris muttered, eyes locked on the screen. The data didn't make sense, but the visual was clear. A massive object was materializing just beyond the disturbance, its shape still shifting, its size impossible to determine. "Sir," the comms officer said, voice tight with alarm, "we're receiving a transmission." Rourke frowned. "From who?" The officer shook his head. "Unknown origin. It's not Zelari, and it's not on any of our standard frequencies." That sent a ripple of unease through the bridge. The battlefield was chaotic, but no one had expected this. "Put it through," Rourke ordered. The moment the signal connected, the bridge lights dimmed. A deep, resonant voice filled the air, not in any language spoken by humans or Zelari, but in something older, something that seemed to bypass translation entirely and echo straight into the mind. "You have disturbed the veil." Rourke's breath caught. The voice wasn't just heard, it was felt, pressing into his skull like a weight. He saw Harris grip the edge of her console, her face pale. The others looked just as shaken. Vorkath, still aboard his command ship, heard the transmission as well. His mandibles twitched as he turned to his officers, demanding answers, but none came. Even the Zelari, a species that prided itself on its superiority, seemed momentarily frozen. Then the thing in the void moved. The ironclad sensors surged with data, but none of it was comprehensible. The readings fluctuated wildly as the object took form, a jagged, shifting silhouette against a backdrop of stars. Its surface pulsed with an unnatural glow, bending light around it as if it existed half in and half out of reality. Then came the second voice. This one was different, colder, more precise. "Your war is insignificant. Your existence is tolerated, but your actions have crossed a threshold." Rourke didn't speak. He couldn't. Every instinct screamed at him that whatever they were dealing with was beyond them, beyond anything either humans or Exalari had ever faced. Vorkath was the first to react. "All ships form defensive lines," he snarled. "We don't know what this is, but we will not be—" He never finished the sentence. The entity shifted, and without warning, one of the Zelari battleships near its position simply vanished. Not destroyed, not obliterated, just gone. The bridge of the ironclad fell silent. Harris swallowed hard. "Sir, what do we do?" Rourke didn't answer right away. His mind raced through every possible scenario, but none of them mattered. This was no longer about the battle. This was about survival. The voice returned, deeper this time, resonating through every ship on the field. "Your conflict is irrelevant. Your war ends now." And then, the entity turned its attention toward the ironclad. The ironclad shook violently as the entity's presence bore down on them, an unseen force pressing against the ship's hull like an ocean current threatening to pull them under. Every screen flickered, data feeds scrambled, and for a terrifying moment the ship's artificial gravity wavered. Rourke clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. "Harris, tell me we have a way out of this!" Harris's fingers flew over the controls, her eyes darting between erratic readouts. "I don't know what I'm looking at, sir. Whatever this thing is, it's rewriting the physics around us." The voice returned, deeper now, as if it had truly noticed them for the first time. "You are not meant to be here." The lights dimmed further, the ship groaned, and then, without warning, the ironclad's comm systems lit up again. Not from the entity, not from the Zelari, but from something else entirely. A voice crackled through the static, a voice that should have been impossible. "Captain Rourke! If you're hearing this, then we don't have much time." Rourke's stomach clenched. The signal was faint, distorted beyond recognition, but something about it sent an icy chill through his veins. Because it wasn't just any voice. It was his own. Harris turned to him, her expression mirroring his own disbelief. "Sir, that's you?" The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but before anyone could speak, the entity shifted again. The battlefield itself seemed to warp. the stars bending unnaturally, space rippling like disturbed water. The Jalari fleet, once disoriented but still standing, now erupted into chaos. Some ships fired blindly, others tried to flee, but none of them had an answer to what was happening. Then another ripple passed through space, and something else appeared. It wasn't an enemy fleet. It wasn't another incomprehensible entity. It was something far worse. It was the Ironclad. But not their Ironclad. The ship hung in the void like a shadow of itself, identical in every way down to the last scrap of mismatched armor. Its hull was scarred in ways that hadn't happened yet, and yet it existed. The crew stared in stunned silence. Harris swallowed hard. What the hell is going on? The comm signal flared again, the voice growing clearer, but the distortion still crackled through every word. Listen to me, Rourke. This isn't your fight. We already made that mistake. You have to get out of here before it locks you in. Rourke's grip tightened on the console. Who are you? He demanded, though he already knew the answer. The voice on the other end hesitated for just a second. You already know. The entity pulsed, and suddenly the second Ironclad was moving. It wasn't an illusion. It wasn't a recording. It was real. And its weapons were charging. Vorkath's command ship sent out a desperate transmission, his voice ragged with barely contained fury. Human! Explain! But Rourke had no explanation. None of this made sense. The entity wasn't just an ancient force. It was something else entirely. Something beyond war, beyond logic. And somehow, it had brought another version of his ship into this fight. Then, the second Ironclad fired. The blast ripped through the Zelari formation, sending shockwaves cascading through the battlefield. Rourke's crew barely had time to react before their own ship's alarms blared again. Harris turned to him, horror in her eyes. Sir, we're reading a power surge. The other Ironclad just activated something. The comm crackled once more, the voice now laced with urgency. You don't understand what you're dealing with. You have to leave. Now! But the entity was already watching, and it wasn't going to let them go. The Ironclad shuddered as the blast wave rippled through space, shaking every bolt in its mismatched hull. The second Ironclad, the one that shouldn't exist, was moving with purpose now, its weapons locking onto the entity as if it had faced this nightmare before. Rourke's mind raced. If that ship was them, or some version of them, then it meant one thing. They were caught in something far bigger than a simple battle. Time, reality, cause and effect, it was all breaking apart. And the entity was at the center of it. The comm crackled again, his own voice, desperate now. You have to trust me. We tried to fight it. We lost. The only way to escape is to break the cycle. A fresh wave of distortion rippled through space. The stars twisted, and for a fraction of a second, Rourke saw something else. A flash of countless versions of the Ironclad, looping endlessly, locked in this same fight again and again. Some destroyed, some fading, some lost in a darkness so deep it made his stomach twist. The cycle! Harris was still staring at him, waiting for orders. The crew was frozen in place, caught between fear and disbelief. But Rourke understood now. If they stayed, they would fight. If they fought, they would lose. And then time would reset, trapping them in this battle forever. The only way out was to do what none of the others had done. He had to leave. Rourke slammed the comms open. All hands, prepare for emergency FTL. Engineering, I don't care if it rips us in half. Do it. Harris spun toward him. Sir, if we jump now with that distortion field active... We either jump or we become ghosts, Rourke snapped. Go! The entity pulsed, sensing their defiance. Its energy surged, wrapping around them like invisible chains, pulling the Ironclad deeper into the rift. The second Ironclad fired again, this time directly into the core of the anomaly, its final desperate act to disrupt the loop. Everything shook. The gravity warped. Reality itself screamed, and then, with a blinding flash, the Ironclad jumped. The stars blurred, space twisted, and suddenly everything was still. The ship hung in the void, silent. The alarms were dead. The screens flickered weakly, struggling to process what had just happened. Harris let out a slow, unsteady breath. "Are we out?" Rourke didn't answer right away. He was still gripping the armrests of his chair, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. His own voice, the second ironclad, the entity, the cycle, the sensors, finally stabilized, showing nothing but empty space. No Zilari, no anomaly, no impossible ship mirroring their every move. It was over, or at least it should have been. Then the comms crackled. One last time, a faint transmission, barely more than a whisper. His own voice. Not far enough. Silence filled the bridge, thick and heavy. The crew sat frozen, staring at the flickering comms display. That voice, his voice, had followed them across space and time. It was barely a whisper, but it was enough to send a chill through Rourke's entire body. Harris turned to him, her face pale. "Sir, what do we do?" Rourke exhaled slowly. The answer wasn't simple, but he knew one thing for certain. They had broken the cycle. The entity, the distortion, the endless loop. It was gone. Or at least, they had escaped it for now. But the whisper on the comms, the lingering echo of something unfinished, told him they weren't entirely free. He pushed a button on the console, shutting off the last remnants of the signal. "We move forward," he said firmly. "No more looking back." The crew seemed to take in the words, letting them settle. Harris nodded and turned back to her controls, checking the ship's status. "FTL drive is holding. We're intact." "But," she hesitated. "There's something strange about our position." Rourke frowned. "Define strange." She tapped the display, bringing up the star maps. "We jumped out of the anomaly, but our location isn't right. We're close to human territory, but some of these star positions don't match our charts. It's like..." She trailed off, hesitant to say it. Rourke finished the thought for her. "Like we ended up in a different version of our universe." Nobody spoke. It was an unsettling idea, but after what they had just been through, it wasn't impossible. If they had broken free of the cycle, maybe they had landed somewhere outside of the path they were supposed to take. Harris forced a small, shaky smile. "Well, at least it's a universe where we're alive." Rourke let out a dry chuckle. It wasn't much of a reassurance, but it was true. The ship was still standing, his crew was still breathing, and no impossible entities were reaching through space to pull them back into the loop. For now, that was enough. "Set a course for the nearest human outpost," Rourke said, leaning back in his chair. "Let's find out what kind of universe we landed in." As the engines powered up and the stars began to shift again, Rourke cast one last glance at the darkened comms panel. The whisper still echoed in his mind, but he refused to let it take hold. Not far enough. Maybe that was true. Maybe they hadn't escaped completely. Maybe there were still things lurking just beyond what they could see, waiting. But for now, they had a future to reach, and whatever was still out there, whatever had followed them from the void, would have to wait.